Hey, it's Nick and it's Jay, and this time on Lemon's World, we're going to talk about the Nader Haters Subaru swapped Chevy Corvair. Now, before we even get started on that, the 24 Hours of Lemons, we pride ourselves on not having a 1,000-page, 1,000-pound rule book. And the problem with series that have those rule books is, yes, every little nitty-gritty mechanical detail is spelled out in great detail, but it always winds up meaning that all of the cars wind up being kind of similar. For this class, you've got to get an Acura Integra. That's the dominant car. For that class, you've got to have this particular gear and suspension package of Chevy Corvette. Whatever it may be, all of those pages create a lot of sameness. So, Lemons, with our tiny little rule book, you can build whatever the hell you want.
Exactly right, although I take exception to the notion of we pride ourselves, because we have absolutely no pride. A lot of people come at this reality, though, and they say, well, that's great. That means I can put anything into anything, and it's going to dominate. I'm going to build that car that Detroit never thought of. I am so smart. Well, the truth is, it's actually a little more complicated than that. Like, even General Motors, they have 500 people whose job is simply to say, well, that part, to make it work with that car, you got to do all of this stuff. It leads to a lot of frustration, and occasionally, when you really work the puzzle, it leads to cool stuff.
For example, this group of friends who are made up of, in their own words, old fart hot rodders, motorcycle racers, and general knuckleheads, they built something really cool. This, of course, is the Texas-based team, the Nader Haters.
These guys built a Corvair, a second-generation Corvair. And you might ask, well, why would you choose that car to hot rod? The answer is, the team captain, he liked the way that it looks. And before you start laughing about that, he's not wrong. The second-generation Corvair is Bill Mitchell at the height of his powers, and I've always thought that's an underappreciated, really good-looking car. And in fact, you look at the greenhouse on that thing, it is BMW E9, which everybody says is the greatest greenhouse in the world, 5 years before the BMW E9. It's a good-looking car. Still a Corvair.
One of the features of the admittedly good-looking Chevy Corvair is the horizontally opposed flat engine that's out in the back. Now, this is a very unique arrangement that, only so many car companies are dumb enough to even try.
Introducing the new 911 Turbo from Porsche.
So these guys knew they did not want the General Motors flat opposed engine. And they thought, well, what else is going to fit in there that isn't going to cost $35,000?
Introducing the new 911 Turbo from Porsche.
Okay, so now they've got the plan. They want to do a Corvair, they want to do a Subaru motor. Where do they get the stuff? Well, the reality is, you look at a car like this, you might say, why you ruin classic? These dudes drove down some road in Texas, saw one in a yard, offered $300, and went home with it. Floor pan was totally rusted out. That's how you get a classic to run in Lemons. Subaru WRX, you can find one that's been crashed by a 17-year-old that was vaping. Totally easy. So now they've got all the pieces.
Now, of course, even a WRX that has been totaled by a vaping 17-year-old, it's not free. They're not that cheap. So these guys, they did what you got to do. They got the whole thing. It was totaled. They took the motor, put it on the garage floor, took everything else, the shell, the interior, the sound system, speakers, all that kind of stuff, and they sold it off. And in Lemons, we let you do that. You can counteract what you overspent by selling the parts and getting the money back. So after that, they'd solved everything, and the whole build came together smooth as...
The engine, 2-liter Subaru WRX, pretty much stock. The rear suspension was a challenge, and this is where you start to get into, it looks like it'll just bolt in, but then once you start doing it, it really doesn't. This second-gen Corvair, of course, is a vastly improved rear suspension design from the original swing-axle Corvair. The second gens had a separate lower control arm, but then still used the drive shaft as the upper control arm and locating piece for the entire rear spindle. So their plan was to not use the stock Corvair half shafts as locators for the suspension, so they had to fabricate from scratch their own suspension links.
So just for the record now, we're talking about, we're going to do a motor swap, and now we also have to invent an entirely new suspension.
Pretty much it.
And as if that wasn't enough fun, it turned out the original front suspension was also just terrible. It had horrible bump steer. They couldn't get disc brakes on it that actually worked. So they kind of wound up making a front suspension as well. In addition to, now they have an all-wheel drive transmission and a two-wheel drive car. So they had to modify the Subaru transmission. So now it's only two wheels instead of also going out that way. Was not a small job.
Now, the next problem to address was cooling. Of course, the original Corvair was air-cooled, and at the time, I guess that was a thing, but since then, I mean, who other than DKW was stupid enough to do that?
Introducing the new 911 Turbo from Porsche.
The WRX obviously is a water-cooled design, so they had to figure out how to get a radiator, coolant hoses, all of that into this car. The motor placement that they decided on is sort of a rear mid-engine situation, so they decided to put the radiator, intercooler, other cooling-related stuff in what was formerly the trunk. The problem there is that the radiator is sitting at an angle that's almost flat, and there's no airflow. They've got fans hooked up, but the way the coolant flow is, they discovered that they're only using about a third of the coolant capacity. And they've got a bunch of little small niggling problems. The oil cooler line leaks, their welded-on custom clutch bracket tends to break off mid-race. The suspension, there's camber issues, there's alignment issues. It's a work in progress, but every time they bring this car, they fix one of those things and it gets a little bit better.
And on the subject of getting a little better every time, the first 20 laps that this car ever run, there was this rain of rust particles that kept falling from the roof and wafting up into the driver's eyes. They don't have that problem anymore, so at least that's solved. The point here is these guys have taken on what turns out to be a real challenge. It sounds easy. Take an American car with the engine out there, put another engine that looks the same out there, you're done. Well, we now know it's not that easy, but it's also not impossible. And this car gets faster and faster. These guys have more and more laughs every time they work through it. And sooner or later, I swear to you, this is going to be a Celine S7 with Corvair body on the outside. It is going to be awesome.
And if it isn't quite a Celine S7 yet, it is still an incredibly cool, very unique build that has been really rewarding for these guys, even if they haven't yet had the race success to show for it. And that's the thing, you can show up with a turnkey, stock, whatever, run lemons, that's fine. But if you want to build something really cool, and you're the kind of person that considers the journey to be the real reward of a road trip, then doing something like this is totally encouraged, and you won't find anywhere in our rule book that says that you shouldn't do it.